Sorry, let me start over. I think the mic was cut off. Hi everybody. Good morning. My name is Jeffrey. Again, we're talking about commonly asked micro and macroeconomic questions today. We're going to go over each question, all the answer choices, why each one is right or wrong, and then finally why the right answer is what it is. And then we're going to go over a previous tutor's answers just to make sure that they got it right as well, and then amend that answer however it needs to be amended. With that being said, we're going to start with the first question. So, the first question says economists use the gross national product, or GNP, to measure blank. One is the output of a nation's citizens regardless of where they are. Two is economic output within a nation regardless of ownership. Three is the output of foreign-owned businesses within a nation. And four is any business activity taking place outside of a country. And so this is really just a definition-based question, not really much going on here calculation-wise. We have to be familiar with the term GNP, and this is most often confused or tested alongside the definition for GDP, gross domestic product. And so it's really important to know the difference. So gross domestic product, which is one we normally use, is a measure of economic output of the sum total of all final products produced or goods or services produced in the country within a given country's borders geographically in a single year. And that's contrasted with the GNP, which is what we're dealing with in this question, which is the sum total of the gross of the final goods and services produced by the citizens citizens of a nation, regardless of borders, right? So you might have a nation's citizens who are living abroad, working at foreign companies, and not necessarily foreign companies, but working outside of the United States. And so those people would also be included in the GNP, but would not be included in the GDP. So keeping that kind of distinction in mind, answer choice one, the output of a nation's citizens, regardless of where they are, that's going to be the best answer here to fit the way we're looking at GNP. So let's take a look at the previous tutor's answers. The previous tutor said the output of a nation's citizens, regardless of where they are, which is good. And they said the GNP of an economy is the aggregate value of all final goods and services produced by the resources owned by residents of an economy in a given period, usually a year, irrespective of the geographical placement of the resource. It is a sum of private final consumption expenditures, government expenditures, investment expenditures, net exports, and the difference between the income earned by residents from foreign investments and the income earned by foreign nationals from their investments in the domestic economy. It is used by economists to measure the output of a nation's citizens, regardless of where they are. Right, so that's great. And again, this is really just a definition question, so this is just something that you have to be able to memorize and be familiar with. I'm going to say great answer, and we can move on to the next question. So the next question says, why is the automobile industry considered an oligopoly? One, it offers little differentiation within the market. Two, it has significant barriers to entry. Three, it is controlled by companies that patent key technology. Four, it relies on price variation to attract customers. Five, it depends on brand loyalty and images to generate sales. And six, it is dominated by a few key players. And so it's looking like that this is a question with maybe multiple answers that we have to check off. So why don't we go over them one by one? So number one says it offers little differentiation within the market. And so that's not necessarily the case, both in terms of an oligopoly and in terms of the automobile industry, right? So for an oligopoly, it's possible for there to be a little bit it's possible for there to be a decent amount of differentiation between the products, and that's why there are multiple different kind of key players that are dominating this industry rather than a single key player, or rather than many key players, right? Because if you have many key players, then everybody's going to have the exact same product, and there's going to be little ability for competition to exist, right? Sorry, if everybody's the same product, there's going to be a lot of ability for competition to exist, right? So it's possible for it to be some degree of differentiation. So it's not one is not going to be one of the ones that we check off as correct. Two says it has significant barriers to entry. And so this is going to be the case both for oligopoly and for automobile industries. In oligopolies, we see that if there's only a few key players, it's possible that it takes a significant amount of upfront capital or other kind of significant barriers to kind of enter this industry. And in the automobile industry specifically, we know that, it costs a ton of money to design a car. It costs even more money to build the infrastructure and factory and capital necessary to build a lot of those cars. And so nobody is really able to one day just be like, I'm going to start the next big car company, right? There's a lot of large barriers in which you have to overcome those barriers in order to enter this industry. So 2 is something that we're going to check off as, yes, a reason why the automobile industry is considered an oligopoly. 3 says it is controlled by companies that patent key technology. So this isn't really true in the automobile industry. It could be true in an oligopoly, but it isn't true in the automobile industry. We don't really see that it's the problem for getting into automobile manufacturing is a result of patents. The real problem is in the form of the capital required and the investment required in that infrastructure. So 3 isn't going to be correct. 4 says it relies on price variation to attract customers. And so this is going to be something that isn't really happening in oligopolies. We don't see, and in the automobile industry, we don't see necessarily that the reason we buy from certain car companies over other car companies is primarily because of price variation, right? Whether it be it's more expensive or more cheap, that there are other things that differentiate these products that don't have to rely on price indicators. When we would see price variation is if we had a set of products from these companies that are almost identical, and then you would be using price variation as indicators of quality. And so if that's the case, then we might see price variation. But because automobiles are able to be differentiated, we can think of brands like Mercedes versus Honda versus Toyota. There's also kind of traits of cars that align with each of those separate brands. And so, that there's less of a need for that price variation to attract customers. So we're not going to pick 4. 5 says it depends on brand loyalty and image to generate sales. And this is the case that, a lot of the times because oligopoly firms are kind of in this game theory situation where they're all interdependent, the way for firms to build a customer base is through brand loyalty and images in advertisements and marketing. And so we'll see that in both the automobile industry and in oligopolies that firms are going to invest a lot in those types of approaches towards increasing customer demand. So 5 is going to be something that we would consider to be correct. And 6 says it is dominated by a few key players. And this is really key for what an oligopoly is at its core. And it is true as well for the automobile industry. You'll find that a lot of car companies are owned by the same few, not car companies, a lot of car brands are owned by the same few car companies. I think Volkswagen owns like 8 to 10 different brands in the car industry. So there are only a few major players that are at play in the automobile industry. And that's one of the hallmark features of an oligopoly. So we would mark that as correct as well. So I believe that the 3 that we've marked out of the 6 as reasons why the automobile industry would be considered an oligopoly are 2, it has significant barriers to entry. 5, it depends on brand loyalty and image to generate sales. And 6, it is dominated by a few key players. So let's take a look at what the previous tutor said. The previous tutor said 5, it depends on brand loyalty and image to generate sales. 6, it is dominated by a few key players. And 2, it has significant barriers to entry. So that's great. So we've got the same stuff. So let's take a look at what the previous tutor wrote in terms of their rationale. They wrote that an oligopolistic industry is the one that is dominated by a small number of large manufacturing suppliers with relevant market shares each that grants them significant bargaining power over consumers and market supply. The firms operating this market type are large and capable of influencing the market with their actions. The scale operations of incumbent firms makes it hard for potential firms to penetrate the market. Since all firms are big in terms of market share and revenue earned, they become strategically interdependent. Any price cut action to poach into the market share of others induces competitors to follow, leading to price wars that damage all firms in the long run. It's observed as firms will choose to incur short-term losses rather than losing their market share to competitors in the long run. This implication discourages price competition, and hence, firms engage in price competition that thrives on brand building and advertisements. Firms depend on brand loyalty images to generate sales. Yeah, so I think that covers all three reasons that we talked about. There's some minor grammatical issues. We'll say minor grammar issues, but all the answers are adequately discussed. But other than that, I think it goes over the key things that we talked about as well. And we can move on to the next question. So the next question says, whenever there's a shortage at a particular price, the quantity sold at that price will equal 1, the quantity demanded at that price, 2, the quantity supplied at that price, 3, the quantity supplied minus the quantity demanded, or 4, quantity demanded plus quantity supplied. So when we talk about shortage, we should be referring to our supply and demand graph to just inform exactly what we're seeing happening on the graph, right? So let's take a look here. So we have our supply and demand curve, and then we have a supply curve. And so this is our equilibrium point where we normally see our equilibrium price and quantity happening. And a shortage would be if price were below equilibrium, right? So if we have P1, that's going to lead to quantity supplied here and quantity demanded here. And so this is our shortage, right? We have an excess quantity of goods being demanded at this price level and not enough of this quantity being supplied at QS. And so that leads us to have a shortage. So the question says, whenever there's a shortage at a particular price, the quantity sold at that price will equal which one of the following. And so we're talking about how many of these goods are actually ending up traded between consumers and sellers. And so that answer is going to be the quantity supplied. Every single unit that producers supply into this market is going to be bought by consumers, and then there's going to be this gap between people who still want to buy the good but are not able to because there's that shortage and nobody else is producing any more goods at this price. So it's going to be something that says quantity supplied, and so taking a look, it looks like answer choice 2 says the quantity supplied at that price, and that's going to be the right answer here. Whenever there's a shortage at a particular price, the quantity sold at that price will equal the quantity supplied at that price. And so everything that's supplied is sold, and then there's an excess of demand. Let's take a look at the previous tutor's question to see if they got the same thing. So the previous tutor said the quantity supplied at that price as well. And then they said a market experiences a shortage of products when the price prevailing in the market is less than what its equilibrium would allow. When the price is lower than the equilibrium, consumers are incentivized to increase their quantity demanded as per the law of demand, while producers are discouraged, causing a decrease in the quantity supplied. As the quantity demanded and quantity supplied move in opposite directions, a shortage is created in the market. Since the quantity supplied is lower than what is demanded, the quantity supplied becomes the quantity sold. And they have this graph to help. And so, great solution in graph. And I just want to clarify that it doesn't seem really clear at the end what they mean by, since the quantity supplied is lower than what is demanded, the quantity supplied becomes the quantity sold. So we can say that because because demand is so high, quantity supplied all units that are supplied will find buyers. And that's why the quantity supplied becomes the quantity sold. All units that are supplied will find buyers, while no other units will be sold afterward because no more units are produced. That's why the quantity supplied becomes the quantity sold. So we'll mark that as correct, and we can move on to our next question. The next question says, which statement best describes the law of demand? 1. The quantity demanded by consumers increases as prices rise and decreases as prices fall. And 2. The quantity demanded by consumers decreases as prices rise and increases as prices fall. When we talk about the law of demand, we can see this relationship most adequately on a demand curve. So we have our graph, we have our demand curve. On the y-axis, we have our price, and on the x-axis, we have our quantity. And so we know that the law of demand tells us why the demand curve is shaped the way it is and is depicting this relationship between price and quantity. So what we're seeing is that quantity demanded by consumers is going to go down as prices rise. That's why we have this negative slope. And it's going to increase as prices fall, right? From this point to this point, the price is falling and the quantity supplied is increasing. So looking at the answers, we're looking at answer choice 2, which says that the quantity demanded by consumers decreases as prices rise and increases as prices fall. Now, we don't even have to go to the graph. There's several other ways we can answer this question. The first way is you could just memorize it. The law of demand is a very fundamental concept in economics, and so it might be a good thing just to have that definition in the back of your mind at all times. Second, we can go to the graph. Third, we can just think rationally about what the relationship between price and quantity demanded should be. If something is more expensive, we are going to want to buy less of that good, right? If I told you that for lunch you could buy a burger for $25, you're definitely only going to buy one burger, maybe two, right? But if I told you that for lunch a burger was only $1, then you're going to buy a lot more. And so that kind of rational thought process or thought experiment will tell us that quantity demand is going to have a inverse relationship with the direction of prices. And so, just keep those things in mind. So let's take a look at the previous tutor's answers. The previous tutor said 2 as well. The quantity demanded by consumers decreases as prices rise and increases as prices fall. And they say the law of demand is the fundamental principle that governs the market. It states the quantity demanded of a normal good or service is inversely related to its price, ceteris paribus, which means holding all else equal, such that an increase in the price of the product leads to a decrease in its quantity demanded, and a decrease in the price of the product leads to an increase in its quantity demanded. Other factors that affect demand are said to be constant. That's what ceteris paribus means. And this law establishes demand as a function of price. We want to clarify that this law establishes quantity demanded as a function of price. Otherwise, right answer. And so we want to just keep an eye on that, and we can mark that as correct. Okay, let's take a look at this next set of questions. So this question 6 says, which of the following economic goals focuses on equal opportunities for education? 1 says equity, 2 says freedom, 3 says growth, and 4 says security. And so, this is, I don't think this is entirely an economics question, but we know that freedom and security are going to be the 2 choices we can eliminate off the bat, just because they're seem tangentially related to the idea of equal opportunities for education. So we can consider equity versus growth. So equity, again, refers to the idea that we should have an equal distribution of resources for everybody rather than the most efficient distribution of resources. Meanwhile, growth is going to be influenced by education, because investment in education or pursuit of education is going to increase the human capital and therefore increase the growth of potential GDP over time. And so those are the two reasons why we're leaving equity and growth. I think there's an argument to be made both ways. I would personally lean more towards the equity answer choice, just because there is a specific phrasing in the question that says focuses on equal opportunities for education rather than saying focusing on opportunities for education. I think that would, if it were just opportunities for education, then that would be more of a growth-oriented answer. The fact that it clarifies equal opportunities would seem to be more of an equity-based answer. And so that's the reason I would go with equity. And so we can take a look at what the previous tutor said for question 6. Question 6, the previous tutor said growth. And so let's take a look at the rationale. They said growth focuses on equal opportunities for education because education would create skilled manpower and an efficient human resource would trigger production processes in the economy, which in turn increases the growth rate. And so we can write in our own answer just to clarify why it's not necessarily going to be growth. Not necessarily growth, could be equity. The question specifies equal opportunity is it equal opportunity? Equal opportunities for education. Which is different from specifying opportunities for education. It's not necessary. Providing equity of opportunity would fall more so under the category of equity than growth. However, the previous tutor's link between growth and human capital is correct. All right, let's take a look at the next question. Question 7. Marcel takes out student loans and works part-time to put himself through college. In time, he earns an advanced medical degree and goes to work in an understaffed city hospital. Marcel's economic decisions benefit the goal of efficiency by 1. Making his own job, 2. Related decisions, 3. Paying back loans to reduce debt, 4. Contributing to the nation's productivity, or 5. Taking advantage of equal opportunities. And so, again, we're talking about the goal of efficiency. And the goal of efficiency is just to maximize kind of societal benefit in terms of economic decision making. And so we're not going to be talking about personal, like individual based benefits. We're talking about society based benefits. So making his own job, the work in the understaffed city hospital, that job already existed. So it's not that Marcel created his own job, more that he fulfilled a job in need. So it's not going to be that. Related decisions, I'm not sure what that refers to, so we're going to not go with that. 3 says paying back loans to reduce debt. Again, that's an individual decision, and then not one that would affect society overall. 4 says contributing to the nation's productivity, and so yeah, I would say that this is going to be the only answer choice here that really links back to this idea of efficiency, because Marcel is able to advance his own human capital, and by that effect, add or contribute more to the overall economy and overall society. So that seems to be a favorite for our answer choice. And then the last one, answer choice, says taking advantage of equal opportunities. And so again, that's more so the idea of equity rather than efficiency. So we're still going to stick with contributing to the nation's productivity as our answer choice. Let's take a look at the previous tutor's answer. So for 7, they said, in this question, the goal of efficiency is surely benefited by contributing to the nation's productivity. No other option is directly related to efficiency. So yeah, I agree with that. And so we can say that's the correct answer here. Let's go to the next question. Excuse me. The next question is question 8. They say 2 countries produce milk and dairy products efficiently. Neither has an absolute advantage. However, country A exports milk to country B, and country A imports cotton from country B. Which of the following is inferred? So the first answer choice says the opportunity cost of producing milk is lower for country A. Then the second answer choice says the opportunity cost of producing cotton is higher for country B. C says country A has a natural resource advantage in cotton, and D says country B has a natural resource advantage in milk. So we're going into this idea of basically comparative advantage, right? Neither country has an absolute advantage. We're in a situation where there's 2 goods, just milk and dairy products. Milk products and cotton products. And then there's also this idea of trade involved, right? So we know the rule that we're following when we're dealing with 2 countries trading with 2 goods is that each country should focus on producing the good in which they have a comparative advantage, aka a good in which they can produce the good with a lower opportunity cost than the other country, and then they can trade with each other to reach a bundle of goods that is outside each of their domestic production possibility frontiers. And so in that sense, we can use the type of import/export that a country is doing to act as an indicator for opportunity cost if we assume that these countries are acting efficiently. And so if country A exports milk to country B, that means it is making an excess amount of milk and then trading that excess amount to country B in order to receive cotton, right? And so that means that if country A is focusing on the production of milk so that it can export that to country B, that means that country A must have a lower opportunity cost of producing milk compared to country B. Meanwhile, if country A imports cotton from country B, that means country B must be focusing on the production of cotton, and that's why country B's opportunity cost of producing cotton must be lower than country A for them to be doing that kind of focused production. And so looking at the answer choices, we're picking between A and B, right? C and D, talking about a natural resource advantage, has nothing to do with this idea of comparative advantage, right? And so natural resource advantage might imply an absolute advantage over the other country, but we're interested in the opportunity cost of production. So dealing with opportunity cost, it looks like the first answer choice A, which says that the opportunity cost of producing milk is lower for country A, that's going to most adequately match up with what we said had to be the case for comparative advantage in this context. So if we pick answer choice A, we can take a look at what the previous tutor said to see if they got the same thing. So the previous tutor said from the question is inferred that the opportunity cost of producing milk is lower for country A. That means the country has a comparative advantage over another in producing milk because they can produce it at a lower relative opportunity cost or autarky price in comparison to country B. So yeah, it's the same answer. So we'll be satisfied with that and we can mark that correct. Question 9. Yeah, I don't believe question 9 has actually this chart that they're talking about, so we can skip that. So do question 10. The United States can manufacture books at a much more rapid pace than manufacturers in Indonesia. Which of the following is a reason? A says Indonesia as a developed country has a highly paid and experienced workforce. B says Indonesia as a developing country has a less advanced manufacturing infrastructure. C says the United States as a developing country has a high comparative advantage in manufacturing. Excuse me. D says the United States as a developing country has a lower cost of living than Indonesia. So we can go down these one by one and kind of break down why they may or may not be the right answer. Answer choice A, Indonesia as a developed country has a highly paid and experienced workforce. So relative to the United States, we would not classify Indonesia as a developed country. We would classify it as a developing country. So that's one reason this is wrong. And second, we know that in relative to the United States, Indonesian workers will be less paid, less highly paid, and less experienced in terms of education compared to those in the United States. And so that difference is also going to kind of eliminate this answer choice from consideration. B says Indonesia, as a developing country, has a less advanced manufacturing infrastructure. And this is going to be true, right? Indonesia is a developing country, and it does, compared to the United States, have less advanced manufacturing. We have more advanced technology, more advanced capital, probably more factories capable of manufacturing books. And so that's going to be something that prevents Indonesia from competing with the United States as well in terms of rapid manufacturing of books. C says, we're going to go over other answer choices just to make sure we're not tripped up by any of these. C says the United States, as a developing country, has a high comparative advantage in manufacturing. So the first thing that's wrong with this is that the United States isn't a developing country, it's a developed country, definitely. And second is that, again, the ability to manufacture a good at a more rapid pace than another country is not a function of comparative advantage. It's a function of absolute advantage, right? The United States definitely has an absolute advantage in this production compared to Indonesia. But whether or not it has a comparative advantage is up for debate, right? Because the United States might have a more advanced manufacturing infrastructure, but it also means it is more capable of producing other goods besides books. So the United States might actually give up more by producing books because it can't be using the same technology or same infrastructure to produce other things like, I don't know, cars or something like that. Meanwhile, Indonesia, despite the fact that it might have a less advanced manufacturing infrastructure, is going to have less trade-offs in terms of focusing on the production of books. And so it's possible that at the end of the day, it would be more in the interest of both countries for Indonesia to focus on book manufacturing and the United States to focus on a different goods manufacturing because of comparative advantage, right? So we can see that that's not going to necessarily be a reason we would choose that as a right answer. And then D says the United States, as a developed country, has a lower cost of living than Indonesia. And while the United States is a developed country, that normally means there's going to be a higher cost of living in that country compared to other countries. So it's not going to be D. So number 2, Indonesia, as a developing country, has a less advanced manufacturing infrastructure. That's going to be what we would favor as the right answer. So let's take a look at what the previous tutor said. The previous tutor said that the reason could be that Indonesia, as a developing country, has a less advanced manufacturing infrastructure. Other reasons could be clearly stress on comparative advantage of the country. So I'll write a real quick addendum to question 10 for why I don't believe comparative advantage is necessarily the case. Comparative advantage refers to an ability to produce a good with a lower opportunity cost. But the question clearly focuses on the ability to produce higher volumes of the good, which would be tied to absolute advantage instead. So that's my rationale for why it wouldn't be comparative advantage. So we can keep those in mind and then move on to the next question. 11 says, a group of nations establishes a free trade zone. What does most likely affect? The first question says cost of trade increases. Second says exports decrease. Third says imports decrease. And fourth says trade increases. And so what we really have to understand here is what a free trade zone is. And it's basically this idea of that trade should be able to happen with very little or no government intervention. So very little tariffs or anything like that, or no quotas or things that restrict free trade, right? And so the idea behind a free trade zone is that if there are less barriers to trade, then more trade will occur. And so that's going to be what we're looking for in our answer choice. So answer choice 1, cost of trade increases. We know that if we eliminate things like tariffs and quotas, the cost of trade is going to decrease and there's going to be less barriers to trade, so or less transaction costs. So that's going to be incorrect. 2 says exports decrease and 3 says imports decrease. And so if we expect trade to go up, then we would expect exports and imports to both increase as there's more interchanging of goods between countries. And 4 says trade increases, which is just the general answer that we were looking for in the first place. So we can go with that as the most likely effect. So let's take a look at what the previous tutor said. Previous tutor says that when a group of nations establishes a free trade zone, the most likely effect would be an increase in trade because free trade zone would create more opportunities for growth of trade. So yeah, that basically covers it. And so we can move on to question 12. Question 12 says, the United States may have a tariff on cotton products from China in order to, 1, prevent Chinese manufacturers from losing profits because of low prices, 2, protect the business of the American cotton growers and manufacturers, 3, stop trade due to political disagreement on economic policy, or 4, promote sale in the United States of cotton products from China. And so there's 2 ways to answer this. First is just the conceptual reason why we have tariffs, and second is from the graphical interpretation of what international trade looks like. In terms of the conceptual reason, almost always when we impose tariffs, unless they're for some sort of punishment concern or like, kind of like a sanctions kind of things, most of the time tariffs are imposed in order to protect domestic industry from being undercut from foreign producers, because what we see when we have tariffs on certain products is that we're trying to slow down the import of those products into the country, because if we slow down imports, then that gives opportunity for domestic producers to ramp up their production and kind of protect their market in the domestic consumer base, right? That's going to be the general reason why we have tariffs, and so that would indicate that answer choice B, protect the business of the American cotton growers and manufacturers, would be the optimal answer. But the second way to understand this is by looking at the graphs. It's a pretty complicated graph. I think it might be better if I just look one up. So we can look at the tariff graph. So we'll take a look at this one. Okay, so what we have happening, right, for normally with no tariffs is going to be at P1, where P1 is equal to supply of the EU. So in this scenario right here, we're dealing with this UK, United Kingdom versus the European Union scenario, right? United Kingdom is going to be your domestic economy, and European Union is going to be your world economy. And so that's the economy in which you would be importing from or exporting to. So in a global market, right, with international trade, we're not going to see an equilibrium at this intersection of supply and demand. And the reason we don't see the equilibrium is because the price that we deal with is not just isolated to the domestic economy. It is set by the supply and demand in the world overall. And so if the European Union is the world and their price is P1, that's the price that the United Kingdom has to face domestically as well. And so with no other intervention. And so at P1, we see that there's going to be a drastic shortage, right? We have Q1 is where P1 intersects supply of the United Kingdom, and that's where the domestic supply goes to. And then Q4 is where we see the price intersects the demand curve, which is where domestic demand goes to. At that price, that's how much domestic demand is. And so we have the shortage between Q4 minus Q1, where domestic producers are only producing Q1, but domestic consumers want Q4 amount of this good. And so the reason this is going to be okay as an equilibrium point in this market is because we have the ability to import. And so the United Kingdom can import the difference between Q4 and Q1 from other countries who might have a price above their own equilibrium point. And so if you're importing, you can make up this difference between Q1 and Q4, where Q1 is still being produced domestically and then the rest is imported from other countries. And so the problem with this is that, yes, you're benefiting all the consumers, but there are certain domestic producers who are hurt from this because without any international trade, they would be producing at this intersection point between Q2 and Q3. But with domestic trade, they're only able to produce at Q1, so they have much smaller producer surplus. And so what tariffs can do is kind of help bridge that gap and allow domestic producers to produce a little bit more than they are without tariffs. And so a tariff is effectively raising the price that it costs to import. And so we see that P1 increases to P2. And then we see that at this higher price, the quantity supplied domestically goes up from Q1 to Q2. And area 1 is the increase in producer surplus, so where domestic domestic producers are benefiting. Meanwhile, the quantity demanded goes down from Q4 to Q3, and the shortage is reduced to Q3 minus Q2 instead of Q4 minus Q1. And so we're still importing. We're still importing the difference between Q2 and Q3. But Q2 is larger than Q1 in terms of domestic production, and then the imports is also smaller in terms of how much we're getting from other nations. And then the final effect is areas 2 and 4 are lost to dead weight loss because they are not being generated anymore as parts of tariff revenue, which is given by the difference between the two prices and multiplied by the amount of imports being taken from other countries. And so this is kind of a complicated graph, but hopefully if you understand this, then you can also see how tariffs serve the purpose of protecting domestic consumers and businesses by allowing them to increase their producer surplus. But on the other hand, it's going to hurt consumers by giving consumers higher prices, and it's also going to be inefficient because of dead weight loss in areas 2 and 4. And so that's kind of the deal with international trade graph. We can take a look at the answer choice picked by the previous tutor. So previous tutor says the United States may have a tariff on cotton products from China in order to protect the business of the American cotton growers and manufacturers, aka a policy of protectionism. And so yeah, that's going to be kind of an abstract way of thinking about tariffs as a way to protect domestic producers. Okay. So the next question says, a Chinese international salesperson hoping to increase exports to the United States may worry about inflation of the United States dollar because inflation may 1. Increase the United States supply of Chinese products, 2. Decrease tariffs on Chinese products sold to the United States, 3. Increase taxes on the United States products sold to China, or 4. Reduce the United States demand for Chinese products, right? So there's going to be a lot going on here. We're talking about inflation. That's going to have impacts on the exchange rate, which will have impacts on exports. When we have inflation in the United States dollar, holding all else equal compared to other currencies, what that means is that the United States dollar is going to be worth less, right? And inflation means that either the quantity of money in the economy has gone up, so prices have gone, or that overall prices have gone up, which means the value of each dollar has gone down. The purchasing power of the United States dollar has gone down as a result of inflation. What that means on the exchange market is that if the purchasing power of the United States goes down, then the United States dollar is a weaker dollar on the international market. And so you might see that the exchange rate from the United States dollar goes from 1 to 1 with China to something like 2 to 1 to China, right? Where it used to cost $1 and $1 United States dollar to buy 1 Chinese yen, but now because of the increase in inflation and a weaker American dollar, it might cost $2 American dollars to buy 1 Chinese yen, and that means that the United States dollar buys less on the foreign markets. That's going to have the impact of reducing exports to reducing imports to the United States, or reducing Chinese exports to the United States, because the weaker dollar means that U.S. buyers are going to reduce their demand for Chinese products. They're simply not going to be able to buy as many of those goods because the prices are suddenly more expensive because the United States dollar is weaker on the foreign markets. And so that's the real reason that a international salesman might be worried about inflation in the United States dollar in the context of exporting to the United States. Looking at the answer choices, answer choice D, reduce the United States demand for Chinese products, is going to be the most applicable answer choice in this question. So let's take a look at the answer choice provided by the previous tutor. So previous tutor says, a Chinese international salesperson hoping to increase exports to the United States may worry about inflation in the United States dollar because the inflation may reduce the United States demand for Chinese products. Inflation would have reduced the purchasing power of consumers due to high prices, and hence demand would have been decreased. So yeah, the same idea of decreasing the purchasing power. Okay, good. So let's take a look at question 14. How would a strong US dollar impact the trade of grain produced in the United States? And so if a US dollar is strong, that means it buys more foreign currency than it used to before. And so what we expect to happen is if there's a strong US dollar, then we would expect one of two things. Either we would see the answer choice says that exports increase because US buyers are able to afford more of foreign countries' currencies and therefore purchase more on the foreign markets. And sorry, it would be not exports increase, imports increase, right? Because you would be able to have domestic buyers buy more foreign goods, and that would be an increase in imports. Or we could see a decrease in exports, in which the strong US dollar means that foreign currencies are going to buy less of the US dollar. So foreign buyers, just in the same relationship that we're talking about in question 13, are not going to be able to afford as many units of US priced goods as they were before, because they're simply disfavored as the exchange rate when the United States dollar is strong. And so one of those two things, and so we can see that we don't have an answer choice which says that imports are increasing, but we do have an answer choice saying that US grain exports are decreasing, and so we're going to go with that as the right answer in this question. And so it looks like the previous group said the United States grain exports are increasing due to the strong US dollar, and that's not going to be the right answer, so we can give a rationale for why that's not correct. So US grain exports would decrease as a result of a strong US dollar. If the US dollar is strong, that means the US is favored. US dollar is favored in the exchange rate, and foreign dollars buy less US goods than they did before. As a result, foreign purchasers will buy less US goods than they did before, resulting in a decrease in US exports. So that's going to be our rationale for why we would see that negative relationship between a strong US dollar and US grain exports. So let's take a look at the question 15. Which of these can be a result of inflation? Number 1 says businesses grow cautious about spending. Number 2 says the business has to cut spending. Number 3 says the price of household items increases. And number 4 says workers benefit from a lower cost of living. And so looking at these answer choices, one of them is going to stand out immediately as the most favorite answer, and that's going to be the price of household items increase. We define inflation as a general rise in prices, and so we expect that household items will also increase in price as a result of inflation. And so that's going to be the best answer choice here. The other ones might be abstractly tied to inflation, but this one's a concrete, almost word for word definition of what inflation would entail. And so question 15 is going to be the price of household items increases. Taking a look at the previous tutor's answers, they also picked the price of household items increasing, and so we should be happy with that answer. The question 16 says if inflation rate increases faster than their income, people will most likely, 1, use a higher proportion of their income on basic needs, 2, spend a lower proportion of their income on basic needs, 3, get more goods and services for less money. Or 4, obtain less goods and services for less money. So if inflation is rising faster than income, what that means is that prices are rising faster than people's income is rising, right? And so what's going to happen in that scenario? We can go down the line and see if any of these answer choices are correct. Answer choice 1 says people will most likely use a higher proportion of their income on basic needs. And this is going to be true, right? People, if there's high inflation, people might reduce their spending, but they're not going to be able to reduce their spending on basic needs because those are, by definition, necessary purchases. And so if the inflation rate is rising faster than income, and you still have to buy all the basic needs that are necessary purchases, then that means you're going to use a higher proportion of your income on those basic needs, right? Because you simply are spending more money than you are earning, then you're proportionally earning more. And so that's going to be one of the impacts. So that seems like a good answer choice for now. B says spend a lower proportion of your income on basic needs. And so if inflation rate were increasing at a slower rate than income were increasing, then this would be true. But because it's not, then we're not going to choose answer choice B. Answer choice C says get more goods and services for less money. And so we know that no matter what, regardless of income, if inflation is increasing, you're not going to be able to get more goods and services for less money because prices are going to be higher across the board. Therefore, you would have to get the same amount of goods and services for more money. That would be the more adequate way to phrase a correct answer. So C is going to be wrong. And then finally, D, obtain less goods and services for less money. And so, again, this may or may not be true depending on the degree of inflation. But we would say that inflation would be more defined that you would obtain less goods and services for the same amount of money if inflation occurs and prices are higher. And so we don't know if number 4 is necessarily correct. And so we're going to stick with answer choice A. If the inflation rate increases faster than their income, people will most likely use a higher proportion of their income on basic needs. And we can check with that previous tutor's answers as well. So the previous tutor said if the inflation rate increases faster than income, people will most likely use a higher proportion of their income on basic needs. Naturally, fulfillment of basic needs comes first in terms of priorities of the consumer. So yeah, that's going to be the correct answer there. So we're good with that. Okay, let's look at question 17. Question 17 says, to increase your standard of living, your wage must 1, rise faster than the inflation rate, 2, rise more slowly than the inflation rate, 3, keep up with the inflation rate, or 4, have a negative inflation rate. So again, if we refer to standard of living as having a greater ratio of disposable income to prices, then yeah, your wages must rise faster than the inflation rate. That's going to be the correct answer. And again, that's because if you want to increase your standard of living, you want to be able to buy more things, then you must be earning more money than the rate at which prices are rising. If you earn more money but prices rise even faster, then effectively your purchasing power has decreased and your standard of living has fallen. And if your wages are rising at the same rate as inflation, you effectively, even though you're making more nominal money, your purchasing power has stayed the exact same in the economy, and so your standard of living has been maintained. So in order to increase your standard of living, your wages must rise at a pace that exceeds the rate of inflation. And so that's going to why answer choice A is going to be right. And so we can take a look at the previous tier's answer to see if they got the right answer. And they said, to increase your standard of living, your wages must rise faster than the inflation rate. If the wages rise faster than the prices rise, then only a higher standard of living can be maintained. And so that's, again, the same relationship that we talked about, and that is the right answer as well. And then question 18 says, look at the map showing the European Union as free trade agreement countries. So we don't have the map, so we can't answer this question. So we're going to be all set in the, as I said, map is not provided in the question. So it looks like we have gone over all of these questions, which is great. We've modified the answers for 3 of these questions. I'm going to go ahead and mark this solution as incorrect just because I want to make sure that some of these corrections are considered, but we're all set to move on to the next question here. So next question says, according to classical macroeconomic theory, changes in the money supply affect 1, real variables but not nominal variables, 2, nominal variables but not real variables. 3, nominal variables and real variables. 4, neither nominal nor real variables. And so we want to know the idea. The first thing we need to understand is the difference between real variables and nominal variables. And when we talk about real variables, the easiest way to think about this is just objective value, right? Or just what are the goods and services being produced, or what is the quantity of goods produced. And then nominal variables are what is the price times the quantity of goods being produced. And so things that are affected by the price levels in the economy. And so that's the distinction between real and nominal. And then we can look at changes in money supply and how those changes affect real and nominal variables. If the money supply is changing, that has no impact on real variables, right? A real variable is just the output level of an economy. How much money is available in the economy has nothing to do with the determinants of supply that determine how much output there is. And so money supply is going to be independent from real variables. However, because nominal variables incorporate both output and prices, and we know that changes in the money supply will affect prices, we can see that changes in the money supply will definitely affect nominal variables as well. And so we're left with this relationship where changes in the money supply affect nominal variables through their impact on prices and will have no impact on real variables, as those two things are independent from each other. And so answer choice 2 is going to be the one that looks the best to us, and it would read, according to classical macroeconomic theory, changes in the money supply affect nominal variables but not real variables. So let's take a look at the previous tutor's answer. Previous tutor says number 2, nominal variables but not real variables as well, so that's good. And they say that the classical macroeconomics theory argues that an economy is self-regulating, which means that it's capable of achieving the natural level of real GDP where all of its resources are fully employed. According to the classical theory, an increase in the money supply will lead to an increase in the amount of money available in the market, increase the spending capacity of the consumers, which will further increase the aggregate demand, causing inflation in the economy. This changes the nominal variables such as price, but does not change the real variables such as output. Right. So I'm just going to take a second to kind of process this this sentence that says an increase in the money supply will lead to an increase in the amount of money available in the market, which increases the spending capacity of consumers. So that gets the relationship wrong, because an increase in the money supply leads to a... Okay, so no, that would be correct, right? So an increase in the money supply would lead to a decrease in interest rates, which would increase investment spending and increase aggregate demand in the short run, causing inflation. But this does not change, again, real variables like output, and so we would not see that being changed. So yeah, so good answer. Nothing wrong with that, and we can move on to the next question. And so the last question says, or set of questions says, what are the 4 phases of the business cycle? I think there's just multiple questions being asked here, so we can just go over these one by one. So the 4 phases of the business cycle, I think it's best to just illustrate this through a graph. Business cycle graph. Right, and so this is probably going to be the one that... This is probably the one that best matches what most of the time you'll see in most classes. So we have this idea of a trough, which is this distance between... the trough is the low point in the business cycle. You have your expansion point, which is the time in which you're returning from a trough or a low point to a peak. At a peak, you are maximizing your actual growth, and then you're contracting to go to the next trough. And so you're rotating through a cycle of trough, expansion, peak, contraction, right? And so that's going to usually follow an upward trend over the long term, and that's going to be what the business cycle is characterized by. So let's take a look at what the previous tutor said. And they said that the 4 phases of the business cycle are trough, expansion, peak, and recession. So, right, recession and contraction are sometimes used interchangeably. I think contraction is a little bit more accurate, so maybe I would stick with that term. But yeah, so the same answer is given by the previous tutor. The second question says, how long do business cycles last? So it seems to be purely a empirical memorization, fact-based question, no calculation involved. I believe the answer is about 5.5 years, but we can, that's really just an average, and it can range anywhere from 2 years to maybe even longer. So let's take a look at the previous tutor's answer. And say it said empirically, the length of a complete cycle on average moves within a range of 2 to 3 years to more than 8 years. And so it's somewhere in that range, I believe. Let me see. Business cycle duration. Yeah, so from the year 1945 to the year 2009, the NBER defined 11 cycles, with the average cycle lasting a bit over 5.5 years. And so something along those range. I would not put too much emphasis on memorizing kind of these random facts. More so understanding the general concepts would be a more efficient use of your time. So the next question says, why does the business cycle affect output and employment in capital goods industries and consumer durable goods industries more severely than in industries producing consumer non-durables? And so we can think of non-durables as things like food or something like that, whereas durables would be things like cars, or capital would be something like equipment or something like that, right? So the idea is, why does business cycle affect the output and employment in those durable goods industries rather than the non-durable goods industries more? And so the reason for that is because durable goods industries, you can delay your consumption of most of those goods, right? Those durable goods are usually not as necessary in terms of the short term, and they're not necessarily priorities for consumers at all times. If they're durable goods, you might have already purchased them at a previous point in time, and so because they are durable goods and they last long periods of time, you're not in the market to purchase those goods anymore, especially if they're expensive now. You might also say, because they're durable goods, they're less needed for you right now, so you can delay your purchasing of those goods until a time in which you have more money during expansion or a peak portion of the business cycle. On the other hand, consumer non-durables like food can be stored for long periods of time, and they will either expire or be consumed fairly frequently. And so that requires consumers to more frequently purchase and repurchase those goods. And so because of that emphasis on urgency or need, even if you're in a business cycle contraction or trough, consumers are most likely still buying those goods because they need to be refilled in the household. And so that's going to be the main reason that non-durables are a little bit more recession-proof than durable goods. And so we can take a look at the previous tutor's answer to see if they gave a similar rationale. So the previous tutor said there is a natural difference between capital good industries in consumer durable goods and consumer non-durable industry. That difference is urgency. Usually and mostly in recession, people postpone their planning of purchase for consumer durable goods, but non-durable goods such as food can't be postponed for long periods. Thus, in recession, capital goods industries and consumer durable goods industries suffer more acutely and make these industries more worse off than the effect on consumer non-durable goods industries. So yeah, that's a good answer. Again, that sentiment of urgency or need, that's why non-durables are going to be more recession-proof. So the next question says, why is it difficult to distinguish between frictional, structural, and cyclical unemployment? So I think this is a good place to break down difference between these three types of employment. I think this is a commonly asked question, a commonly place where professors are making sure you know the distinction. And so we categorize employment into three categories: frictional, structural, and cyclical. Frictional and structural make up what we know as the natural rate of unemployment, and then the natural rate of unemployment plus cyclical unemployment will give us actual unemployment. So that's going to be the relationship between the three types of unemployment. Frictional unemployment refers to unemployment as a result of the job search. So it's unemployment in an economy where even if there were only 100 workers and there were exactly 100 jobs, where you might say there should be no unemployment because there's exactly enough jobs for anybody who wants one. The idea of frictional unemployment is that in this ideal economy, unemployment would still exist because people are going to be going through the process of job search, where they're looking for the job in which they looking for the job that is best suited to both their skill set and their interest. And so new jobs are always being created, old jobs are always being destroyed, and so that turnover and process by which people switch jobs and find the right one for them is going to lead to some sort of unemployment as well. So that's what we call frictional unemployment. Structural unemployment refers to situations in which the economy simply does not have enough of the right types of jobs for the number of people looking for jobs. And so rather than an economy where there's 100 people and 100 jobs, there might be 100 people and only 90 jobs. And so this mismatch between the number of workers and the number of jobs available, that unemployment is more long-term and is also a result of is also what we would categorize as structural unemployment. And so reasons that you might have gone over in class for why there might be structural unemployment can be due to minimum wage, that employers are being forced to pay above equilibrium wages, and that leads to a surplus of labor, which makes up unemployment. You might also hear about strong labor unions in which they're negotiating higher than equilibrium wages, or efficiency wages where employers are being motivated to pay their workers at a higher than equilibrium level in order to encourage efficiency, but that leads to a surplus of employment as well, a surplus of labor as well. And so all those reasons are reasons by which there might not be enough jobs for everybody who wants one in the economy. And finally, cyclical unemployment is simply unemployment that results from the business cycle, especially the portions in time where you're in the contraction or trough portion of the cycle. And if the economy is just simply growing slower than it usually is, then that's going to lead to higher unemployment. And that's why we would have a classification of unemployment called cyclical unemployment. And so those are the three types of unemployment. And the reason it can be different to distinguish between frictional, structural, and cyclical is because a lot of the times these root reasons for unemployment can be interchangeable. So it's possible that somebody's in the process for searching for a job, and that might be frictional unemployment, but it also could be harder for them to search for a job because there's simply less of the jobs suited for their skill set that they qualify for, and that could be kind of a mix of both frictional and structural employment. You're job searching for jobs that aren't impossible to find, but harder to find because there's less of them. And then you can also say, well, maybe the reason that it's so hard to find a job right now is because you're in a recession, and that's part of cyclical unemployment. And so these reasons can all kind of interact in a way where it might be hard to distinguish between the three. So we can take a look at the previous year's answer to see if they wrote something similar. So they wrote that it is very difficult or sometimes impossible to distinguish between these three types of unemployment because they can interplay. For example, a person who quits a job in search of a better one would normally be considered frictionally unemployed, but suppose the former job then disappears completely because the firm is in a declining industry and can no longer make money, our still jobless worker can now be considered structurally unemployed. And then suppose the economy slips into a severe recession so that our worker cannot find any job and he becomes cyclically unemployed. It simply means that one can't be figuring out the accurate reason and cause behind one's unemployment. Nobody roams with a description on their head that shows why this man is unemployed. Sure, so basically again, talking about how there's a lot of interplay between the reasons someone might be unemployed, and that is going to result in a certain level of confusion between which classification of unemployment we might be dealing with. Next question says, why is unemployment an economic problem? And so we've always known that unemployment is usually an indicator of overall economic growth. Usually if there's high unemployment, we would typically be in a contraction or a recession portion of a business cycle. Unemployment leads to a loss of economic efficiency because people are willing to be employed, they're willing to contribute to efficient production of goods or services, but they simply are not given the opportunity to do so. That's going to cause a loss of potential productivity. And unemployment can be expensive. Unemployment will require a higher disbursement of transfer payments in forms of unemployment benefits. There might be a greater drain on welfare resources in the economy from the government, and so all these reasons are kind of consequences that unemployment has in terms of economic efficiency, and that makes this an economic problem. So again, this is a really broad question, so there's multiple answers. So we can take a look at the previous tutor's answer, and they might have said something different. So they said that when one becomes unemployed, it costs them in a number of ways. The time that could be used in production, if they could be employed, now has been wasted in non-productive work like leisure because people don't have a job. The time wasted in frivolous activities as an opportunity cost of wages that could be earned if they had been employed in some productive activity. So I think that's kind of hitting on some of the points we talked about, but there's other reasons. Unemployment is also an economic problem because of lost productivity. It can have implications for the level of transfer payments from the government. It can, and so there's a lot of different reasons in which we might see unemployment have economic effects. The next question says, what are the consequences of a negative GDP gap? And so a negative GDP gap is given by a situation, we can see this on the dynamic aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. So we have our long-term GDP, long-run aggregate supply. We have our short-run demand, and then we have our short-run aggregate supply. And so we would have a short-run equilibrium at this point where we have this gap between short-run equilibrium quantity produced and long-run aggregate supply, which is long-run GDP, potential GDP. And that's what we refer to as a negative GDP gap, right? And so the reason that this is going to be bad is because this gap means there's going to be a permanent loss of productivity because you're underperforming in terms of growth, in terms of the economy. You're not outputting at the potential GDP level, and so everything that is not outputted now will be lost forever because you can't make up for that in future periods of time. And so that's going to be the main impact of a negative GDP gap. So let's take a look at what the previous tutor said. I think for this question, the most important thing to understand is simply that this is the graph that we're talking about. So the GDP graph is the difference. The GDP gap is the difference between the economy's potential GDP, aka long-run aggregate supply, and its actual GDP. The consequence of a negative GDP gap is that what is not produced is lost forever. Moreover, to the extent that this lost production represents capital goods, potential production for the future is impaired. Future economic growth will be lower, and that is also true if you don't invest as much in the current period, then growth in future periods will be lower as well. And so again, there are a lot of ways in which you could talk about the broad abstract consequences of a negative GDP gap. In my opinion, the important thing for you to know is just how do you visualize this on the graph, and therefore you can kind of be able to mess around with that when the question asks you to. And the final question says, what are the non-economic effects of unemployment? And so there are several, and again, this is not really in the span or in the scope of economics as we think of it, but unemployment can have a lot of health impacts as well, and individual impacts on the people who are unemployed. A lack of financial stability can lead to financial strain on the household, can lead to a decline in health, can lead to psychological burdens, and all those things are going to be detrimental to the individual who is unemployed. Other non-economic effects of unemployment, there could be repercussions in terms of, I guess these are still economic impacts. So, I mean, I think that's a big one. That the impact on the individual who is unemployed is a big non-economic effect, non-quantifiable effect that can still be really serious and that should still be really thought about in conjunction with unemployment. We can take a look at what the previous one I've said to get some better ideas. So we talk about
lack of productive activity can result in poverty, increase in crime, clash in family, mental physical illness, instability in the social political economy, and many more. And so I do agree. High unemployment has often been times been tied to higher crime rates, and so that stuff is also going to be not directly economic in impact, but things that we would consider when we are considering the social impacts of unemployment. And so I think, again, that's going to be a good answer as well. So a lot of these questions, I think, especially for this set, are pretty broad questions with really abstract answers. There are a lot of ways we can answer these questions. And so don't worry about matching your answers specifically to what I have said or what the tutor has said, as long as you're understanding the general gist of the concepts being tested. For example, maybe it's not so important to answer the question of why is it difficult to distinguish between frictional, structural, and cyclical unemployment, but it is important to understand the distinction between those three. And so that's going to be where I think you should focus your efforts the most. I believe this is going to be the last question that we have for today. We're going to mark the solution as correct. And so, yeah, hopefully this was helpful for you guys. We're going to be doing this again next week on Tuesday. And so, other than that, I hope everybody's staying happy and healthy at home. And I'll see you guys again next week.